Hello, welcome, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to this BrightTALK panel on containers and cloud native security and DevOps environment. My name is Rick Moy. I'm your moderator for today's session. I'm also the head of marketing at Calvio, a Silicon Valley-based startup company in the advanced threat detection space using deception technology. I'm going to introduce our topic a little bit here, our panelists that we have with a lot of great experience, and then we're going to get into the conversation about all this stuff in the cloud. This is, actually quite a lot of different, buzzwords that we can pick up here, but the general trend is clear towards containers in the cloud, and what does that mean for security in a DevOps environment? Obviously, this change of platform impacts the infrastructure that we use from a production and a security standpoint, but the mission hasn't changed. We still need to harden the environment, reduce the attack surface, and find and stop the bad guys. So perhaps our tools and tactics change to evolve with the times and the infrastructures that are available to us, and not the least of which is the processes need to fit into the new model. The DevOps model. So beginning with that, let me introduce our panelists here. We have Dan Hubbard, who is the Chief Product Officer at Lacework, and he's responsible for driving the company's product and security strategy for public and private clouds, as well as security research. He's been a pioneer in the internet security space for quite a while, covering areas such as reputation, classification systems, and large-scale security data mining. Prior to Lacework, he was the CTO at OpenDNS, where he drove a lot of innovation in that area, and prior to that, he was at WebSense and led R&D there, which is where he and I crossed paths in the past. We have Wei Dong, who's the VP of Product for StackRox. He's responsible for product management and strategy. Prior to that, he was the head of product at CoreOS. He's held senior PM roles for security and cloud infrastructure at AWS, Splunk, and Bracket Computing. He's also part of the investment team at Andreessen Horowitz and came from Harvard. Welcome, Wei. Basham Anant leads product management for Caverin, where he's spearheaded Caverin's cyber posture scoring algorithms, golden posture remediation, security monitoring, and machine learning initiatives. The seasoned product leader in large-scale data and content platforms and machine-driven insights and data integration. He's driven over 20 products and $300 million in revenue. So he's also got a PhD, in operations management from UCLA. So welcome, Basham. Welcome everyone to the panel. A little bit about me. As I mentioned, I'm the head of marketing at the Calvio. Prior to that, I've been in the security space for about 20 years. Ran product management at WebSense, marketing at a number of vulnerability management and antivirus companies, and was the co-founder and CEO of a security test lab called NSS Labs. All right, so on to our topic. Actually, a quick housekeeping note. We want to keep this very interactive, so I'll be throwing questions at the panelists, but you can do that as well. So feel free. There's a button down below your screen where you can ask questions of the presenters or anyone here. So as we go through, feel free to put those in, and I'll try and work those in along with some of my prearranged guidelines here. So without further ado, so let me start off letting my panelists introduce themselves. Dan, with your from your perspective, given the trajectory of containers and the backdrop of in the cloud evolution, what do you think some of the biggest opportunities and challenges lie?
So, I think we're at a incredibly exciting moment where, we've always had change. Things change in IT, quite frequently, but the velocity of change is just compressed to such a small time frame now that things are changing at such a rapid rate. It's, being incredibly hard to keep up. And when there's huge IT transformations that happen in a really quick time frame, that's compressed, it becomes even harder for security to keep up. And I think that's where we sit right now. So the exciting thing is containers are here. They're here to stay. People are going to use them. Things like Kubernetes are becoming very popular very fast. The challenge is that security is quite often behind that trend. So I think generally speaking as an industry, we need to level up on the security side to be more modern and to think of things in the way that modern infrastructure is being deployed in. It's less about the network and about the hardware and about some of the IP addresses and rules and policies. And it's more about automation and understanding the application at a very deep layer. So I think on one hand it is, we need to level up, and it's concerning that security is not moving at the right pace. On the other hand, it's very exciting in that we have a time, a window of time here to kind of reboot the security industry in a way that can modernize and kind of start from a new place where we haven't started before, and learn off of what we've done and the mistakes we've done in the past. So I think one part's super exciting, and one part, hey, we need to really figure this thing out quick.
Perfect. Let's move on to Wei at StackRox.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, the modernization and shifts on the part of enterprise organizations to modern cloud-native application architectures really presents an opportunity to change the way that security is implemented and operationalized. And what I mean by that is if you look at these types of environments and how they're configured and how they're run, they're based on a couple fundamental premises, which is you treat applications and infrastructure in a declarative manner, and you treat them as immutable. And those properties actually give us the opportunity to see how those configurations are transparent, how they're auditable, allows us to automate them for better efficacy, and allows us to actually tie security use cases and functions together across the entire application lifecycle. And so StackRox has a container security platform, and it's a product that unifies security functions across the build, deploy, and run phases of that lifecycle. And so the use cases are still familiar use cases. When you move to containers, you need to think about use cases such as vulnerability management and compliance and detection and response. But with this declarative nature and the fact that you can treat these applications and infrastructures as immutable, you can configure them up front, you can automate those processes, that presents a tremendous opportunity for us to actually change the way that security works on a more fundamental level. Now, the challenges with that shift are that they require and introduce changes to workflows and processes, and on some level, cultural changes in terms of how security operates within the context of what DevOps is trying to do and how an organization looks to minimize and mitigate the overall risk, to their applications and workloads that are running within containerized environments. But we are at an incredibly exciting time where you have platforms like Kubernetes, for instance, that are really hitting its stride, that are really having an impact on how organizations and developers in particular are able to innovate very quickly, to serve their customers better and to push new products out faster. And you see new abstraction layers being introduced into by the community into the ecosystem, things like service meshes and such. And so, I'm incredibly excited for what is to come, because I think we're really just in the early innings of this massive shift towards cloud-native environments.
Excellent points there. And I wanted to now give Basham a chance to, weigh in on his perspective from the Cavern point of view.
Thanks, Rick. So our perspective really is that, in the last 1 year or so, we've absolutely seen container adoption growing. I think the stats that I've seen is that roughly 30% of enterprises have some kind of a container initiative in the mix at the moment. I think as everyone knows, ultimately the main attributes of container-based infrastructures, most oftentimes we do see them, being deployed sort of for the modern microservices type architectures, but increasingly we're also seeing more of the legacy type applications also migrating into a containerized environments. In fact, we have an active project at Cavern to make sure that our own DevOps infrastructure is also migrated to a containerized environment. So the point is, I think, as others mentioned, absolutely an exciting time from an adoption perspective. And the kinds of, from an architecture perspective, relying on the immutable nature, the transient nature of containers, the stats I've seen in this area really, it's like the average container lasts for 2 days, oftentimes just a couple of hours, especially if it's part of some sort of an auto-scaling type environment, versus a virtual machine, which on average lasts for 2 weeks. So it's fundamentally very different, given its immutability, given its transient nature, and the fact that it's intended for extremely dense type of environments as well. Again, the stat there is approximately 8 to 10 containers per virtual machine, right? So on the one hand, exciting time. On the other hand, it also means that it's a brand new type of infrastructure that a lot of our customers are getting their heads around. And more importantly, given the dense and transient nature, we're looking at an infrastructure that has essentially extorted your attack surface significantly compared to what you may have done just in the cloud or using virtual machines. Right, so that's the backdrop in terms of where we are. Now, our perspective really is that containers are essentially part of a broader enterprise ecosystem, if you will. And again, we approach it from the cloud security and risk management perspectives. As you can see on the slide, the left-hand side of the slide is basically what we do, and the right-hand side is essentially how we do it. But generally, the idea here is that we essentially take stock of your entire infrastructure, whether it's containers, virtual machines, cloud services, and so on, and then try to represent risk in a simple, easy to understand, what we call a cyber posture score. But it's essentially made up of what we know about the infrastructure in terms of what you have and what are the risks associated with that infrastructure, and we try to represent it in a score so you can slice and dice, see how you're doing from a security posture perspective. So that's the first layer. Now, feeding the dashboard, if you will, is really the cloud services aspect, the container aspect, and then the compliance aspect. Those are sort of the three legs in the stool, which feed the cyber posture intelligence as we speak. And lastly, in terms of how we do it, to us, it's really that four-stage workflow that you see here. The first part is really identifying what you have. The second part is protecting what you have in terms of configuration, vulnerability management, and so on. But that alone is not enough, so we are increasingly getting into active monitoring of the infrastructure, especially for things like containers. And then respond is really around creating remediation plans with respect to what findings we do have in the mix. So again, we realize that we are one part of an ecosystem, so respond is a combination of things, like it's a combination of generating reports in certain cases, making findings visible in dashboards like Google Command Center, for example, and then last but not least, increasingly, many of our customers also leveraging our auto remediation capabilities, which is really around tying into Ansible and in the future things like Kubernetes and so on. And then predictions are really, this is a continuous security process. Predictions is really, the score is sort of the centerpiece of what we do. So any changes that you make to your infrastructure, we end up predicting a score, and then that hopefully is a score. In our case, the score is a score between 0 and 100. The more the score is, the better you're doing from a security posture perspective. So all these changes that you're making with respect to monitoring and remediation gets reflected in the score somehow, and we make that prediction, and then the cycle continues, right? So again, just to summarize, again, we come at it from a risk management perspective for CISOs and SecOps users, and then the three pillars with respect to what we do is cloud services, operating systems, virtual machines, containers, that actually feed our risk posture management.
Got good. Okay, so I want to go back. I heard some comments from both you, Wei and Basham, that struck me. Immutable and transient, and those are words that I usually hear from my developer friends, not really from my security friends. So, I think it begs the question of, we're having worlds collide here, the DevOps world and the security world. What has your experience been as you've worked with organizations to help them secure, either their clouds or their container infrastructure, which may not be in the cloud, maybe on-prem, partially or hybrid. So can you guys address that?
Sure. Perhaps. Yeah, sure. I can go first, which is, I think we primarily start by focusing and working with customers and understanding on how these properties change particular emphases when it comes to security. So as an example, taking those two properties in particular, the transient nature, which is the transient nature or ephemeral nature of containers will make it harder for potential attackers to persist within the environment, but it also introduces challenges such as how to perform forensics or how to investigate, what particular actions have happened once the container is gone. And so from a product standpoint and in terms of our engagement with customers, we think about the types of opportunities and challenges and how overall risk and threats to customers change in the context of these properties, and then we accordingly sort of focus on building capabilities that align with the fact that those are fundamental advantages and properties of how containers should be used and are being used. And so, for example, on the ephemeral nature, when it comes to the ephemeral nature of containers, we do help customers track and investigate, actions that have happened within their container environments, even if, containerized workload is long gone. And so we provide appropriate functions accordingly. Separately, it impacts how we think about threat detection when certain types of persistence, compared to traditional threat vectors, it looks very different, or the ability to persist in certain ways changes or is impacted. From a standpoint of immutability, one of the great advantages from an operational standpoint is the focus moves away from patching, containerized systems, moves away from those traditional methodologies and moves towards, again, that declarative nature of simply configuring and provisioning and relaunching, a brand new system while tearing down the impacted containers. And so for us, that aligns with the ability to tie together information and action across the entire application lifecycle. And what I mean by that is, as an example, if something is detected at runtime when the container is running, whether that is configuration drift, whether it's an active threat, one of the ways you can address that is, in addition to tearing down that container, you can go back and reconfigure or adjust or change or automate a change to the configuration of the container prior to when it's being re-provisioned, and that helps a customer continuously reduce their attack surface exposure, helps them continuously leverage information that is detected or identified or surfaced on one end of the life cycle, and tie it back to the beginning of the workflow, and tie it back to changes in configuration of the environment up front. And so that's a very powerful aspect of how security can be operationalized differently, where there's this sort of feedback loop or continuity between the provisioning step and what happens once the container is running. And so those are some of the ways that we think about and have worked with customers to address the impact of some of these container properties from a security perspective within their environments.
Excellent. Thanks. I think a lot of folks are, familiar with virtual machines. They've been around for 20 years, quite popular. Containers are still relatively new. Dan, can you help address some of the differences between containers and VMs that are, particularly relevant from a security standpoint?
Yeah, so I think some of them were touched on here earlier. One is, of course, the lifetime of a work unit at any point where an image could come up and go down. From a secure perspective, first principles typically in security start off with visibility. So you have to have visibility into whatever the system is that you're attempting to secure. Without visibility, it's incredibly hard to do anything around detection and certainly around response and efficacy. So in order to get detection or visibility, it becomes critical to be hooked in a place that gives you access to that instance during that time frame. Because if you're sitting there looking at the network, for example, and IP A goes to IP B, and that workload goes away, and a new machine comes back 2 seconds later with that same IP, it's very hard to distinguish. So I think getting the right, being instrumented in the right location becomes really important. For example, at Lacework, we have a sensor agent that lives within the container itself, or on the guest operating system. Another thing to think about in kind of a macro trend is the ability to run containers in a managed service, whether it's EKS or AKS or something from Google. So this abstracts a lot of the hard work it is that it takes for you as a developer to run a lot of kind of the orchestration of the system and the management of the system. So in that particular scenario, you definitely need to have the visibility in a layer that allows you to run at that level to get visibility. So that could be in something as complex as Fargate, which is fully managed, or as less complex as something like EKS or Azure Kubernetes service. So I think visibility is really critical because of the ephemeral nature of these, and also some of the paradigms around checking and kind of pre-deploy become really critical, as in, the runtime aspects are obviously really important after you deploy, but how do I know what I'm deploying is secure before I deploy it? Because the way you're deploying your software and your applications is obviously the most critical and important thing. All of that said, we can't lose sight of the fact that there's a much bigger thing at play here, which is just not about the container. It's about infrastructure as code. It's about orchestrating an entire set of systems which allow me to deliver applications faster. And the container is a key core component of that, but you can't think of it just as that. There's much more to it, whether it's operating within public cloud or private cloud. Either way, you're looking at a much bigger system, and you need to look at the breadth and then, of course, the depth within each one of those. I would say kind of the non-technical explanation is that virtual machines are running an entire operating system and have a bunch of bits that are at a deeper layer versus an image which is running, which may be running for a less amount of time. But either way, you get very similar functionality from them.
Perfect. I'm just curious, like, are the rest of the panelist companies, are you also running agents within the containers to get your visibility? Are you using cloud-native services like CloudTrail or other things, or a combination thereof? As an organization starts to move their workloads up there, what are some of the things they need to think about in terms of deploying to get the visibility?
So just quickly touching on Lacework, we do both. So we have the ability to grab data. We can ingest other people's data, whether GCP, Azure, or AWS. But in order to get the deep visibility for just the container-specific aspects, whether it's be Kubernetes or Docker, we have an agent. Sorry to interrupt you that way.
Oh, no problem. For StackBox, it's not necessary, and it depends on what type of visibility you care about. And so, one of the things about container or cloud-native environments is it introduces these new layers of abstraction. And so which provides the opportunity to instrument at different layers as well. And so for us, we provide visibility and interface with Kubernetes directly, for instance, or Docker at the container engine level. And for certain data sets, if you want to see, for instance, at runtime, what individual containers are doing, then we have a way to actually deploy onto every single container host. And so the visibility and scope and how you instrument really depends on what you want to see. And so that's actually how we think about building our product and working with customers, which is we think about what data sets are most relevant and does the customer need visibility into, and then back into how we actually architect the product and how we collect the relevant data. And just want to add one comment on the previous question, which is differences between containers and VMs is the strength of the security boundary certainly varies across the two, which is containers do not provide a strong impermeable security boundary. They help restrict access to certain shared resources on a host, but we really think about containers as encapsulating an application and its dependencies, and the boundaries around the application, whereas VM is a boundary for the application and its resources, and hypervisor, for instance, is very a small surface area that's responsible for doing that. And so the strength of the security boundary certainly varies, and we do see customers taking that into consideration when deciding what types of workloads to run in containers and not.
Excellent. Basham, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think just a quick summary there. I think all great points there, but generally, I think the key takeaway here is that depending on what presence you have in the container environment itself actually drives the kinds of use cases and the amount of visibility that you can actually provide. In the case of Cavern, we are primarily an agentless solution, so at the moment, the kinds of things that we do are primarily things that we can discern from the Docker APIs themselves and from the container host. That's pretty much what we focus on at the moment. And in the future, one of the key concepts, as it relates to immutability, we have a concept called golden posture monitoring. So the idea there is that, you pretty much know what's supposed to go on inside a container. And so one of our plans is to actually look at what's going on at build time, if you will, and then use that to essentially set a golden state for your infrastructure. We do this today for operating systems and cloud services, and similarly applying the same concepts to containers would be not too much of a stretch for us. So again, the golden posture is what we rely on, and then at runtime, the monitoring sensors that we do use, like I said, for us, it's probably going to be most likely a combination of Kubernetes and Docker itself. So we would just use those to essentially look for changes compared to a golden state, and that would then trigger the rest of the workflow in terms of what gets presented to the user. Now, that again, it obviously for every kind of threat, it's not going to be possible to detect that, but at least for the most common kinds of user errors or other kinds of things where at least the entry-level users on containers are going to make, we believe these kinds of approaches would be sufficient. And then over time, obviously, we need to look at other kinds of presences like Wei and Dan also hinted at.
Excellent. Thanks. What are so you were starting to get some questions from the audience. What are some of the first steps that an organization can take as they're thinking about moving to containers? It's open for anyone.
So, hey, Rick, I'll take that. From a security perspective, I think the first thing is really understanding. It's sometimes is appalling when I meet security people that come from the firewall or the the malware or the threat standpoint and still don't have kind of the minimal understanding of what a container is and why is it being used and what is the addressable attack surface. So I say the starting point is to understand really what is a container. Deploy some containers, run some services on containers, maybe redeploy some things that you have already, maybe it's some of your prototypes, or start research or something, just to get a baseline understanding of what actually is a container, how does it operate, and how does it get deployed. That's what I'd say is kind of the very first step if I was thinking of anything for a traditional security person today.
Great, thanks, Dan. You'd mentioned, infrastructure as a code, or infrastructure as code, and some of the other options that we have, serverless, microservices, things like that. And we have a question here from a panelist regarding IAC and containers, how they work together in the DevOps process. How do you see this changing and evolving in the future, given how quickly the technology landscape is changing?
So yeah, I think the big trend in infrastructure as code is that a lot of the reasons that these what I consider pretty simple problems are happening today, configuration mistakes, is because of the power behind the infrastructure as code, and some of the complexity. And let's face it, these things are pretty complex, and complexity is typically what drives problems and mistakes and security issues. So I think the ability, who thought 5 years ago, you could buy 10,000 servers for 4 hours? That was just, really kind of unheard of. Maybe, 2010, really, really hard to think about doing that. That's a reality that people are doing that now, and the ability to auto scale and bring these things up and down is super powerful. But all of that is on the backdrop of how do I secure all of this stuff, and how do I know all of it's happening? And although, I would say sometimes we fall into kind of this Bay Area or West Coast bias where we just believe everybody does, immutable images with least privileges and no one can log into machines and everyone has perfectly running containers. The reality is it's not even close to that in most environments. Most people are starting to just deploy, starting to figure this out, or taking a legacy app, which wasn't necessarily built or purpose fit for the public cloud, and then they deploy it into public cloud or even to private cloud in containers. So it's very early. Now, of course, there's early adopters and there's bleeding edge companies out there, but it's very, very early. And I think the understanding of infrastructure or code, again, starts off with visibility, and that's just not about containers. It's about what are my policies, what are my configurations of my PaaS services that I use, what are my configurations of my IaaS services, how do I get access and visibility into all that to make sure that I have, the proper configuration and I can audit it and, map to my favorite compliance thing over time. But infrastructure code is going nowhere, and it is a critical aspect of the DevOps process, no doubt.
Excellent, thanks. In terms of visibility into these, these cutting edge services that are out there now, it stands in stark contrast to some of the experience that I've personally seen with organizations that are still struggling to get good visibility inside of their on-prem environments, and their private data centers. They may have a SIEM set up, but they don't have logging from all the right places, or they have too much in one place and not enough in another. I'm wondering if StackRox or Cavern, if you guys can talk about the visibility from that perspective and what you're seeing. How are folks addressing, given where likely a lot of folks are still running their production in some legacy environments and starting to move into the cloud and containers. How are they making that transition with the visibility? Is it a new opportunity, or is there existing baggage?
Yeah, Rick, I mean, for our customers, they really view it as it's a mix of both, but primarily a new opportunity. And it ties back to your previous question about what are some of the first steps that an organization can take to ensure strong security and best practices, which is the opportunity that, from a visibility perspective, that arises is the ability to gain visibility into what we think of as the software supply chain, which is even before container applications ever deployed. You can start to look and trace back the artifacts that are used, in this case container images, and how they're configured, along with related metadata and artifacts like Docker file or Kubernetes manifest, deployment YAML, and such. And so, this idea of gaining visibility into the software supply chain, everything that's happening as these images get packaged up is incredibly powerful, because you can, collate, and you have, centralization of all that information, in a single place, moving through a pipeline, and that ensures, good security hygiene from the start. And that's, I would say an opportunity that, cloud native environments, really introduce, because these components that, developers are building are scoped down. They are meant to, ideally be, as minimal as possible. And so as a result, you can actually, gain quite granular visibility into, what is going to be introduced into your environment, earlier and upfront, in the app lifecycle. And that's really complementary to, visibility at runtime. You do still need to have visibility and be instrumented to understand, what is going on with containers once they're running. But visibility should really start, a lot earlier than that, starting with, image security and answering questions such as, are vulnerabilities being introduced, into my containers, into my containerized applications and such. And so for us, we typically and have worked with customers who've been very successful at implementing and gaining that visibility into that sort of container software supply chain that's part of their cloud native environment.
Good points. Very few software is a single source, right? We've got lots of libraries and modules that we incorporate from other places, which are potentially untrusted. Does that are there different expectations from a governance perspective in the cloud? Have those been written, or how is the from a governance and compliance perspective, how is that being addressed?
Sure.
Yeah, so maybe so maybe I can take a crack at that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. So when it comes to compliance, I mean, the problem hasn't gone away, to be honest. But that being said, everything that you heard on this call, eventually, if you can actually construct a continuous compliance regime that follows many of the practices that Wade, Dan, and I have been talking about today with respect to, the visibility aspects, starting from, the images, your container hosts, your, runtime environment, and so on. All of that absolutely, feeds a continuous compliance regime. That being said, ultimately containers are really around a application environment. So, from a compliance perspective, if you're an e-commerce company and you're running an e-commerce website, you still have your PCI compliance requirements. Similarly, GDPR is probably something that's top of mind for a lot of companies, especially that it's now in effect in full swing at this point. So none of those concerns go away. So my take on it is really ultimately a lot of what you heard in this call absolutely essential, and then on top of it, setting up a governance and continuous compliance regime and the entire stack, right? Whether it's containers, whether it's your cloud accounts, operating systems, virtual machines, taking them all together as a holistic infrastructure, and then representing your compliance posture in addition to your security posture. I think it's definitely a best practice to keep in mind. And the way Cavern has approached it is, again, the risk score that I talked about, the cyber posture score. It's got a dimension to it which is more compliance-oriented. So if you're a chief compliance officer or someone that's responsible for audits, you've got a slice of that score that's more compliance-specific, that's really based on the kinds of regulations that impact you, whether it's PCI, HIPAA, GDPR, and so on. So you can actually take that, and then the rest of the workflow with respect to what you do if your score is low is very similar to what you would normally do on the security side as well.
Rick, I would just add that, one of the great things from a governance and compliance standpoint for the ecosystem is that we now have organizations like NIST and CIS, the Center for Internet Security, come out with container-specific guidelines. So NIST has published a reference guide numbered 800-190, specifically talking about guidelines and security best practices for containers. And additionally, CIS has issued benchmarks for Kubernetes and Docker, and some of which we have incorporated into our product, for instance, to automate those checks. But the idea is that the industry and the ecosystem is advancing support from a governance and compliance standpoint by having those types of references in place, and we have seen customers turn to those types of that work for guidance.
Yeah, this is Dan. I think the great thing is compliance is so compliance was a pretty boring thing previously. It was like your semi-annual audit where a bunch of auditors come in and check a bunch of things that don't really matter. And there was always this saying that compliance doesn't mean security. Now compliance and configuration are going hand in hand, and it certainly is a key aspect of understanding not necessarily do you have vulnerabilities, but are you vulnerable? So compliance, I think, is being an important way, especially to get budget, to buy in kind of, because executives understand compliance, we need to be compliant. But the other thing is it's not binary. Like compliance typically is a binary thing that says you shall not do or you shall do X, Y, and Z. And the reality is that that's not the way the world works. There's different reasons why you want to do different things at different times. So it has to be smart. It has to be deployed in a smart way, and it has to be able to be configured and or have some level of training or machine learning behind it, which allows you to account for the things that may be okay in your environment or not okay that aren't part of the benchmark. The simplest example is, the S3 bucket that gets open and it's got confidential data and, your company's in the newspaper. Well, there's a lot of very good reasons why S3 could be public. Maybe your website runs on S3. Maybe you have PDF documents. Maybe you share stuff with the world, on an S3 bucket. So it's not just about that one check. It's about looking at, it holistically and looking for the ones that shouldn't be opened or have been closed in the past and now have become open in some way. So it'd be great if it was as easy as you just need to be quote unquote compliant, but it has to be a little bit smarter than that. Otherwise, people just simply will ignore it or won't use it.
One quick thing to add to what Dan said. One of the stats that I saw fairly recently is that companies that fail a PCI audit will eventually get breached within 12 months or something like that. That's what the stat went about. So the point here is that compliance probably is the continuous compliance absolutely is one of the first starting points with respect to being secure. But it's necessary, but it's not sufficient, right? I mean, a lot of the techniques that are being talked about in this call, that's really about, how do you close the gap between compliance and security, right? So, but the basic bare minimum is absolutely, at least make sure that you're compliant and then some.
What are, one of the things I've also seen with organizations, this is, as new technologies roll out, they can be part of the Wild West, right? You want to adopt them, explore them. You're as an organization, especially as a startup, you're kind of pushing on that gas pedal to try these new things. And so account security is one of those things that maybe falls short, right? It's free to sign up for a SaaS account, get provisioned and go build something, and as a skunkworks or proof of concept, and then lo and behold, that becomes production environment that you're running, a growing business off of. How does that, how do you guys address that problem for organizations?
This is Dan at Lacework. There's two, we think of users and accounts in two different ways. There is the accounts, which are the accounts, your keys and the identities of the people that are provisioning services within your public cloud. So, for example, your AWS account or your Azure tenant or your subscription or your roles that you're deploying. And those are critical to protect because those are the keys to all of your infrastructure. So we have the ability to monitor those accounts, make sure that they are passing kind of best practices, like you have to use MFA or passwords shouldn't be turned over, or should be turned over every 90 days, or should be complex, or unused accounts should be checked. So that's one level of kind of account security, and those are really critical, especially on the key side, because a lot of the problems that you see with people that are getting their infrastructure abused by things like Bitcoin miners is because their keys are getting out into GitHub or Trello boards or something else publicly. The other one is your actual user accounts themselves, which in our case and in most cases it is like the SSH account of the user. Now, in most containers, typically hopefully that account doesn't exist, but it may exist on the host operating system, in which case you need to account for the security of that. So there's a bunch of security around that, like should people be able to connect to my machines from externally, or should they go to a bastion? What's the role of those people? Can they, are people logging in from 3 locations at the same time? Is the user doing an anomalous behavior that they haven't done in the past? Is someone trying to brute force attack one of our accounts on a machine? So I think you need to look at both of them. I think as we drive towards more containers and least privilege on the machines themselves, and with Kubernetes, the nodes and the pods, the notion of a user or an account will go away, or should go away. Now it'll take a long time to get there, but certainly you're going to have accounts and roles to run your infrastructure. So you need to look at both of them.
Yeah, at StockRocks, we one big aspect of where we help customers and across our security offering is with regards to privileges. So if you look at some of the published scenarios or vulnerabilities out there, a lot have to do with inappropriate or levels of privileges that were granted. So there's a case with Tesla and exposure of a Kubernetes dashboard with elevated privileges. Yesterday there was a new vulnerability published regarding Kubernetes, new vulnerability discovered with respect to user being able to, with relatively low privileges, to bypass authorization to kubelet APIs. And so for us, we think about privileges. If you look at Kubernetes, a few releases ago, they implemented role-based access controls to help with that. And so that is a dimension of this that we look at. And part of it is tied back to what I said earlier, which is containers cannot and should not be treated as a strong security boundary. And so we think about privileges for containers and different systems and users, and with respect to what they can do within the environment, because we've seen that as a underlying source for some of the security issues that have been published over the past year or so.
The one thing I would definitely add, back to my comments around golden posture, most of our customers absolutely are dealing with way too much complexity. And one of the emerging best practices that we've seen is really that you sort of define what's kind of normal for your environment at every level in the stack, whether it's a cloud account or it's a virtual machine or even containers. So once you have a norm that's defined in terms of a golden posture, the problem with respect to security then, for the most part, comes down to monitoring against that golden posture. So that's an emerging best practice that we have absolutely seen with respect to how customers want to grapple with complexity.
Good. So let me move on to another set of questions. What are some of the containers, despite being declarative and immutable and transient and all that good stuff? What are some of the myths that persist about container security that we should debunk or get out in the open, or at least be aware of?
Yeah, I think one has to do with what I was saying earlier about containers actually providing that strong isolation, because they don't. And I think if a customer, for instance, wants to run a containers environment with multi-tenant workloads, they should be thinking about what appropriate levels of isolation and security boundaries should be. So I think that's one that we sometimes see. I also think the other is that containers are only good for microservices based application architectures, and that's not the case. We've seen customers containerizing all sorts of different types of workloads, and there are various efforts within the community and broader ecosystem to actually support containerization of those varied workloads. Whether they're newer, more modern, microservices based, or in some cases legacy applications, and people looking to get more agility and portability up front, or even addressing upgrade issues with legacy apps without necessarily having to build them in a 12-factor microservices-based way. And so that is one of the I think big myths that a few years ago when containers really started to take off, you saw a lot of companies say, well, this isn't for me because it's really only applicable to brand new apps for customers who are further along in terms of DevOps or CI/CD and things like that. But it's really not the case, and we've seen a lot of customers have tremendous success with containerizing all sorts of workloads that are not necessarily just microservices based.
I think another interesting thing is that if you scale containers without orchestration, you're exponentially increasing your attack surface. Not only that, it just becomes unmanageable. Like, you don't get the net benefits of operating in a container world. So at a certain point, you have to choose, how do I orchestrate all of these things? So, Docker Swarm, Mesos, Kubernetes, AKS, EKS, whatever, you name your favorite orchestration system. Then the problem is a little bit different, because you've actually got, in theory, a more centralized system. So you've got a centralized system which has a common set of principles that need to be secured, and that's great because you've got a shrinking attack surface. But then the problem becomes the security issue is now you have a central managed thing. So in the case of this Kubernetes vulnerability that Wei briefly touched on, or we did research and found 21,000 open Kubernetes management services on the internet. So instead of getting access just to one container in that diverse population, you actually are getting access to everything, or potentially everything within one cluster. So although you may have less or a smaller attack surface, the damage or the problem becomes much larger, because if someone hits that one thing, they can of course do a lot more than they could in one or the next. So if you're going to go to containers, you're going to go to a management system behind it. You got to make sure that management system is rock solid, and you have a security posture that wraps around that at the same time as obviously going after just the containers.
Excellent. Well, quite a lot to think about. Let me interject here as we're getting towards the end of the hour. Anyone in the audience with questions, this would be the kind of your last call, if you will. Get your questions in now. We've got some great experts here ready to answer them. Good. And Basham, did you want to weigh in on that final question, or move on?
I would say, I would definitely reiterate what Wei already has said. I mean, the idea that containers are moving beyond just microservices, absolutely something that we're noticing. In fact, one special case of what I'm describing, or what Wei is describing here, really, in the past, I think maybe 2 years ago, the idea that you need to store data as part of your application was sort of a not so good idea for containers. But we absolutely are seeing customers actually deploying containers which need to store and write things to a database and so on. So that type of behavior is absolutely something that we are beginning to see, especially as they migrate legacy applications into containerized environments. But then what that also means is that the traditional problems that one would have with VM-based applications is something like, with respect to config management or vulnerabilities, is something that you also need to keep an eye on as you do that migration.
Indeed, yeah, and one of the unique ways, at least my company at Calvio is using containers is a way of deploying decoys, some false services within the organization, as a way of identifying lateral movement and attempts to connect to services that they can't do. And with containers, it gives us as a deployment method, it gives us a great way of moving forward and putting these types of things in places where they could pretty speed and precision. So pretty helpful. But as we're getting towards the end of the hour, I'm not seeing any other questions from the audience. So why don't I open it up for closing remarks? Maybe Dan, starting with you, just kind of a summary and some recommendations for the listeners.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just reiterate kind of from the opening remarks. I think this is a super exciting time to reboot what you think and how you think about security, and how you think about your security infrastructure. It's not what has changed. Everything has changed, and we need to think about it completely differently. It's not about the network. It's not about the infrastructure. You don't own the network in the public cloud, of course. When it comes to containers, of course, there are a little bit more similarities if you just think of containers within the private data center. But as soon as you migrate those or trying to bridge the public and the private data center, you need to think about things quite a bit differently. And that means a whole new set of kind of security controls and solutions. And I think there's a few exciting things out there. I think one of the exciting things is that I think in the future to secure your infrastructure, you're not going to need 57 vendors to do it anymore, like most companies have today. It's going to be a combination of one or two kind of best-of-breed platforms, some open source, and then some tools that are provided by the cloud service providers. So I think we're entering kind of into a new era of security, and it's super exciting.
Awesome. I agree. A lot of opportunity. Wei?
Thanks, Rick. Our observation is that the move to containers and cloud-native app architectures is impacting nearly every organization out there, every industry. It's a tremendous shift, and for security in particular, it really presents a new set of opportunities and challenges to the way security is operationalized, and that really keys off of a couple things, which are the new technologies and abstraction layers that are introduced into the system, into the stack as a result. So platforms like Kubernetes, like Istio, and such, as well as the fundamental properties of containers, which provide ways of introducing new workflows and processes, and automating security to become to be more effective and keep up with the speed and scale at which DevOps teams are operating, which are driving the agility and innovation for organizations. But also there are challenges and changes due to those properties, and so it's not about extending traditional security solutions or methodologies. There's really a need for container native approaches to how security is actually implemented within these types of environments, and that's really for the industry as a whole, a great chance that I hope that we all can capitalize on.
Indeed. Basham, over to you.
Yeah, so I think my takeaway here is that I think, as an industry, we need to help try and keep things simple. And as I said before, at least some of our, more visionary customers are definitely trying to get a handle on complexity with respect to, containers, cloud, and so on by actually defining what normal and what the golden state represents and managing to that. So that's, again, one way of dealing with it. And then the other thing that I think we'll see a lot more of this year is really, I think, the tie between monitoring solutions like the products that have been talked about on this call and orchestration systems like a Kubernetes or a Mesos and so on, or Ansible for that matter, right? So that tie, I think, is going to be probably one of the most untapped, but one of the more valuable kinds of things that we'll see emerge during 2019 and beyond.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I want to thank my excellent panel, Dan Hubbard from Lacework, Wei Dong from StackRox, and Basham Anand from Kavarin for their time and sharing their expertise on containers and cloud-native security today. And thank you for the audience for listening, and feel free to visit each of these companies for additional resources as you begin your cloud security journey. Thanks, and this concludes the presentation. Thank you.